Bibles, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Yesterday we had I think it's our second leadership meeting. Next Sunday marks our third year of existence, so I think it's our second one. And if you notice, our buddy on the keyboards, where's he at? Anthony, he's wearing a knee brace, and I'm walking with a limp. And Eli's got a sore shoulder. Mark says there's nothing wrong with him because he works out every day. But we went bowling after our meeting, and man, I am hurting. I'm hurting. And you know what, man? These guys, I'm the pastor. You'd think they'd let me win one game? One game, right? No. Anthony takes one. Eli takes two. Right? But that's what we're dealing with here, selfishness. So we're going to wait on the Lord to make some changes, No, it was a good day. Fellowship among the church body is always a good day. And we discussed a lot of things about where the church is going and like that. So thank you guys for being a part of that. And thank you guys for visiting. Are there any first-time visitors? I know there's one. I'm not going to front her. Okay, thank you. I was about to front you off. So that is Susanna. And Susanna, hey, welcome. And Susanna is a great help to us over there in San Bernardino as well. And she comes with a lot of love and a truly big heart. So thank you for being here with us. Well, how many of you guys growing up had an affection or an appreciation for your teachers? Preschool, kindergarten, junior high, high school? Raise your hand if you did. Okay, all right. So, you did, Arcadio? You did, Cornelius? Wow, okay. I was going to say, if you didn't, then you probably ended up incarcerated at some point in your life. Because that's what happens when we don't respect authority. And I had a lot of trouble with teachers growing up. And it's not because they weren't good. They were probably good. I wouldn't even give them a chance to prove that they were good. I just didn't like them because to me they represented authority. And I had a very difficult time with authority. And so consequently, I learned almost nothing in school. And I didn't like school. I wasn't a fan of it. And the first chance I had, I think when I got to the 10th grade, I started using heroin and I was gone. I said, you can have school and everything. They go, I don't need it anyway. Right? But the older I get, the more wisdom, little by little, I don't have a lot of wisdom, but the more wisdom God begins to pour into my life. And with that wisdom comes a great appreciation and even an affection for my teachers. And God has been merciful enough to give me some great teachers in my life. Pastor Chuck Smith, Pastor Raul Reese, John Corson, a whole bunch of other pastors. My Bible college pastor, David Moore. I know these guys by name. I pray for them regularly because words can't describe how grateful I am. And then when I found recovery, God gave me some of the best teachers there. If you come next Sunday, you're going to meet a man. He's going to give me my cake. He would be my grand sponsor. His name is Chuck Gates. And this guy is an incredible teacher because he lives by example everything that he teaches. In fact, he doesn't even need to say much. All you got to do is watch him. And he's been clean 48 years. He loves the Lord. And while God can use anybody, God chose him to actually start this ministry. Him and Jack opened the door for a Bible study. I don't know how many years ago. How many years has it been? Like 15 years, maybe? Something a long time ago. And God, they felt, spoke to them and said, have Mario teach the Bible study. And all of that became what we have now. And God only knows how many souls have given their life to the Lord and special things that have happened in all kinds of lives because of that. Well, in chapter 8, where we were at last week, and in chapter 9, actually all of 1 Corinthians, we meet another great, extraordinary teacher that I'm sure is going to go down in history as one of the best ever. And his name, of course, is Paul the Apostle. And in chapter 8, Paul instructs, if you were here last week, he instructs or teaches mature Christians to be patient, to be loving, to be kind, to be merciful, generous, and understanding to those Christians who are weaker in their faith as they go through their process. Why? Paul said, because if you're not sensitive to them, they're going to become discouraged and they're going to stumble, they're going to relapse, they're going to backslide. Terrible things are going to happen because their minds and their spiritual baby heart is very fragile. So if you would just put aside all of your experience, your titles, your knowledge, your wisdom, and just talk baby talk with them. Can you do that? Right? That's what Paul challenges with last week in chapter 8. And so the question is, how do you do that? And I'll tell you the truth. I've been walking with the Lord for some time now. And sometimes I will forget. When I'm talking to a new Christian, I can come off maybe a little rude or insulting maybe. Because I forget that, well, where's Isaiah? Isaiah's somewhere. How old is Isaiah, Nicole? What if I started talking about Isaiah, about employment? Hey, Isaiah, you don't even have a job yet? What is wrong with you, man? Right? 5 years old, right? Well, that's funny, right? His mom talks to him like that. Okay. Well, that's funny. That's cute, right? But when we're dealing with baby Christians, it can be far more dangerous because we can actually break them to the point where they never come back or never pick up their Bible. They can get wounded. Right? And you can actually break their spirit. So how do you do that? Well, Paul is going to explain it in detail. But what we really do is we put away our knowledge and our authority. A lot of you guys that have been Christians for a long time, you don't realize the authority that you have. You've got a lot of authority. For example, if you know somebody, if you're in recovery and you know somebody that has 25 years clean, oh my goodness, 35, 45 years. Well, when I was new, I didn't even want to talk to those people. I was afraid to say something stupid. I was afraid that they might be rude to me. In reality, they're just people the same way I am. But I'm in recovery and they've got all that time clean. Right? So those kinds of people, whether we like it or not, they have a certain amount of authority and they have the freedom to use it if they want to. Right? And so what Paul is telling us to do in chapter 9 is to forego that. Forfeit it for the moment so you could just share a little bit of your experience and love with the weaker Christian. Right? And what that is really called is sacrifice and selflessness. Sacrifice and selflessness. You'll be doing that a lot after you give your life to the Lord. And so in chapter 9, Paul teaches us about these things, and he shows us by example what that looks like in our Christian experience. Maybe not in our recovery experience, maybe not in our experience at work or at home, but in our Christian experience specifically, he shows us what that looks like, right? Now, because Paul is such a masterful teacher, he's going to set us up for the teaching after he tells us about his sacrifice and selflessness, because what he's going to tell us first is he's going to tell us about the level of knowledge and authority that he possesses so that we can appreciate his level of sacrifice. Because if you don't know what Paul was all about, then you can't appreciate what he's sacrificing. Right? I'll give you a lightweight example. It would be as if though a newcomer had a hard time getting clean, just can't make it, can't identify, having a very difficult time. And old Chuck Gates said, you know what I'm going to do? Let's go to the liquor store. I'm going to have a beer with you. We're going to go back to the meeting and we're both going to take a newcomer chip. Heavy. But would it carry that much weight if somebody with 3 days sober or 3 days clean went and did that with a newcomer? Not so much. We would appreciate it, but not so much. Right? So Paul, because of his teacher, Jesus, is going to show us how to make the ultimate sacrifice. But in order for us to appreciate it, he has to tell us, remind us, not bragging, but remind us of who he is. And I think that when we get into this, you're going to be able to appreciate Paul, as I have, going through the letter to the first letter of Corinthians that we've been going through for the last couple of months. So look at verse 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1. As Paul asks rhetorical questions, right? In other words, questions that we already know the answers to, but they're there to remind us, right? First he starts off and he says, am I not an apostle? Well, of course you're an apostle, Paul. Right? Am I not free? Yes, you are. Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Heavy, heavy statement there. Are you not my work in the Lord? Wow. If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So the first thing we want to ask is, what is an apostle? How many of you guys know what criteria you have to actually meet to be an apostle? There's a very good friend of mine. I won't give you his name, but he's a pastor in Central California. I know him fairly well. Nice guy. And I went to an outreach that he had, and one of the guys that was speaking was a friend of mine, and so I went with him up there. And before they did the worship and they got on with the speakers and all of that, a lady went up there and she referred to herself as Apostle so-and-so. And I said, did she say that she was an apostle? And then I'm sitting next to the pastor, right? And I say, hey, did she say? I said, what's up with that? He said, you know what, Mario? It is through her that God has found fit to support this ministry. In other words, she gives a ton of money to our church. And that church has recovery homes for men and women and like that. They have a building and the whole thing. So I would imagine she paid a lot. I would imagine she gives, or through her, the church is receiving a lot of money. So he says, so we call her apostle. And I said, oh, I didn't know that. So what really is an apostle? And I can tell you today that while people love titles, there is no such thing. There is no apostle that lives today. Now, you might hear that if you go to a church. Well, that's deacon so-and-so, that's elder so-and-so, that's pastor so-and-so, and then that's apostle so-and-so. But that's crazy. It's not biblical at all. Because look at what the criteria are. First of all, an apostle is somebody sent by God on a mission with a specific message and with all of the accountability and authority of the sender. So the apostle has all of the accountability and all of the authority of Jesus Christ who sent him. So if you would have met Paul, and there was a time that the book of Acts talks about, they had a handkerchief that belonged to Paul. And there were people that were sick, and they would go over there and they would touch the handkerchief and they were healed. And it's amazing. It was amazing, right? The authority of his sender. But number two, and here's what gets them all. An apostle is a personal eyewitness of Jesus and his glorified, resurrected body. How many of you know people that have seen Jesus in his glorified, resurrected body? I don't know of one, except maybe a few who said that happened, so they wrote a book and made a lot of money. But outside of those people, I don't know anybody who would even make that claim. But Paul did. Because when he was on the road to Damascus, Jesus appeared to him and had a conversation with him. And there were other witnesses there that saw that whole thing come down, right? And then lastly, the mark of an apostle is the fruit of his ministry. The fruit of his ministry. I don't know how many people we have here tonight. Maybe 30, maybe 40, something like that, right? Not bad. Who knows what God will do in the future? Come next week, I guarantee it might be double this. But what about the fruit of Paul's ministry? Think about this. How many souls have been saved through Paul's ministry? How many churches have been planted through Paul's ministry? How many pastors have been taught and trained by Paul's ministry and Paul's example, his apostleship and teaching over the period of 1900 years? You're going to have to wait till you get to heaven to find out there's just too many. There's just too many, right? But if you can honestly weigh this out, if you can honestly consider this, then you're going to feel the weight of Paul's knowledge, of Paul's authority, his experience, and the freedom to use it. Right? Let me give you just a couple of examples. Imagine if you had a meeting with the Queen. Who is the Queen? Queen Elizabeth? Is that who it is? Whoever the Queen of England is, right? Or the President of the United States, or the Pope. Right? Have a meeting with them. Or if you're in recovery, you're invited to lunch with Bill Wilson or Dr. Bob or Jimmy Kennan. Wants to meet you one-on-one, to have a talk with you, have a sit down with you, right? And imagine that they told you you were wrong, you were mistaken about something, right? Or that they were going to make changes that you disagreed with. Would you argue with them? I don't think anybody would. I don't think anybody would. And the question is, why not? I'll tell you why not. Because you would feel their power and authority, and you would know that they were free to make any changes they wanted to make. Right? That's the level of authority and freedom that Paul had, but he was willing to sacrifice, to forego, to forfeit all of that in exchange for one soul. For one soul. Take off his title, take off his collar, whatever it is, and sit down with a person to speak to them at their level and just exchange some very simple ideas and philosophies, right? So this is who Paul was, and this is what he's going to talk to us about, his own experience, because he's not only a teacher in teaching with his mouth or setting, putting out, what do they call it, PowerPoint, right? This is a guy who lived his teaching. Lived his teaching. And that's one of the reasons I appreciate him so much. But look now at verse 3, and we're going to go all the way to verse 18. Because not only does Paul forfeit and sacrifice all of that, but Paul is even going to refuse compensation that he's entitled to. Okay? He's going to make all the sense in the world about this, but Paul does not accept money for the ministry, and for a very specific reason. So look what he says in verse 3. He says, "My defense to those who examine me is this. Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I?" Barnabas was another apostle, apparently single, without a wife, the way Paul was, right? He says, and I who have no right to refrain from working. He says, whoever goes to war at his own, he asked the question, whoever goes to war at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, and here he quotes Deuteronomy 29 verse 4, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain." Is it oxen that God was concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt. This is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes the wheat in hope should be a partaker of this hope. He says, if we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Right? Am I not entitled to compensation, he says? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, going back to the Old Testament again, and those who serve at the altar partake of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I have used none of these things, Paul says. You haven't paid me a dime, Paul says. Nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. And I'm not asking for a dime now, right? For it would be better for me to die, that anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. I must. I can't keep silent, Jeremiah said. If I forfeit the opportunity to preach the gospel, my bones will catch fire within me. I can't keep my mouth shut. And that's what Paul is saying right here. He says, for if I do this willingly, I have a reward. So he's got a motive. But if against my will I have been entrusted with a stewardship, what is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. So here Paul gives us 3 reasons for compensation for himself and a family if he had one. By the way, Paul didn't have a family so that he could be more available to all of the people he wanted to reach. He said, but if I had a family, if I had a wife, if I had children, would it not be your responsibility to financially support us as I feed you spiritually? And the answer is yes. Right? And so verse 7, he tells us the answer is yes because it makes perfect sense. It's very practical. Right? In verse 9, he tells us that he has a right to compensation because the Old Testament, the law says he does. Right? And then number 3, verse 14, he has a right to compensation because Jesus said he has the right to compensation. Right? But he says that he would not accept money for his service, and I'll tell you why. You got to do a little bit of history work on this. But in those days, both pagan and Christian leaders were ripping the people off, as many do today. Televangelists and like that, people who write books and, give people different information that motivates them. It's in exchange for payment, right? Paul didn't want to be accused of doing the same thing. So he said, rather than have some fool accuse me somewhere, don't give me a dime. I'll just do what I do. But Paul had a part-time job. He was a tent maker. And we're not told here, but in the book of Acts, we find out that there were other churches that were supporting his ministry. But not in Corinth. Too much corruption and things going on, right? So, look at verse 19 through 23, because now Paul's going to talk about his level of commitment and service that is unmatched by anybody since Paul, probably the only one who was more committed and produced more fruit and whose service and commitment was weightier or more than Paul was Jesus Christ himself, right? But look what he says here. Follow me because we're going somewhere with this, and some application is going to come up, and I hope none of you throw coffee at me. Verse 19 through 23. He says, for though I am free from all men, I'm free in Christ, Paul says, right? I have made myself a servant to all. I don't have to be, but I've made myself a servant to all that I might win with the more. Listen, I'm going to heaven either way. I don't have to serve nobody. I've got freedom in Christ. But man, I live and die to serve you people, he says, right? It's amazing. And to the Jews, listen, I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, not being without law toward God, but under the law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. Verse 22, to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Save some from what? What's he talking about? What's he saving them from? From hell. Hell. I don't know if you guys know, but the Pope last month, I think right before Easter, he made an announcement that there is no such thing as hell. It's a whole new church philosophy that's being preached these days, that there is no such thing as hell. If you read the gospel, Jesus spoke more about hell than heaven. There is a hell. And Paul knows that. And see, he knows the seriousness of his ministry, right? But what we're reading here is Paul determined to be all things to all people. Why? For the hope that their eyes might be opened to the truth and love and grace of Jesus Christ. Right? And so Paul expects all the other disciples, namely you and me, along with others, to have the same determination. Right? And so we're not trying to reach Jesus Christ and say, don't you know the 10 Commandments? Honor your father and your mother and give 10% to the church and do all. We don't reach people for Jesus Christ like that. We reach people for Jesus Christ to tell them the truth about God's love. Religious people hit them over the head with the law and commandments and the rigorousness of religiousness. And I don't know about you, but there were a lot of people trying to share these things with me before I came to Jesus Christ. I always missed the love part. And I'm going to use Agnes and Mark as an example. We've been very involved with the premarital counseling. And I can see Agnes's eyes opening up the same way the Bible says that. Wait. Tell me again what Mark's responsibility is. And who said that? And I can hear, we can do conference, I hear them making notes, right? And it's so beautiful because the eyes of the blind are being opened. And you say, wow, I didn't know God had regard for my position. I didn't know that God knew all my sin but loved me anyway. I didn't know that there was enough grace to cover my sins, past, present, and future. I missed that part. My goodness, I feel relieved. Give me some more. And this is what Paul lived to do, right? But he expects that every disciple would be as determined as he is, because look what happens in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. When Paul meets a young man named Timothy who's on fire, he is ablaze with the Lord. It reminds me of some of the guys here in the church, like Jeff and Anthony and Eli and some of the other guys. They're just can't get enough. Yeah, I think it takes us 35 minutes to get from our house to the church. And Anthony fills up every one of those 35 minutes with questions about the Bible, right? And about God and why this and why that. And he's on fire, wants to know more, right? And so look what he says in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 3 about Timothy. I'm reading this from the Message translation of the Bible because it makes it more simple. It says that Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, so a Jewish Christian, but whose father was a Greek. He says, the believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him, Timothy. Paul wanted to take him along on his missionary journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in the area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek, right? So Paul and Timothy, if I was Timothy, I said, wait, you're going to do what? I'm a grown man, right? And besides, in those days, there was no, what do you call it, Mark, when they numb you? And there was no anesthesia. Hey, Paul, you want to do what? And tell me again why I should do that, right? And both Paul and Timothy could have said, hey, we're going to go over there and they're going to accept us as we are, or too bad for them. We're the ones with the life-changing message. But that's not what they did, because that would not have been a true discipleship philosophy, right? True discipleship philosophy is in verse 22. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So, when Paul shared the gospel with religious Jews, he shared it with reverence, with love, and respect for the Old Testament and their laws. He didn't say, man, I don't want to hear all that about the 10 Commandments and Moses and what I shall do and what I should not do. I'm free in Jesus Christ. That's trash, man. He didn't do that. He shared with total reverence and respect for the law, the Old Testament, the position of the high priest, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the temple and all of those things, right? Even though he himself, he was no fool, he knew that he was free in Jesus Christ. But he becomes all things to all men, right? And then when he shared the gospel with pagan Gentiles like ourselves, right? He didn't hammer them with the law. Well, if you want to become a Christian, you got to do this, and you got to do that, and you got to get baptized, and you got to be in church every Sunday, and you've got to give 10%, and you've got to pray 30 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes in the afternoon, 30 minutes in the evening. And you got to do all of these things. He didn't do that either, right? And yet, he never compromised his Christian morality or principle. Never once. Read all the records yourself. Never once. Right? So for Paul and Timothy and us, sharing the gospel should be all about humility and yet without compromise. But humility, right? So John Corson, one of my favorite, I have a world of respect for this guy. He says it this way in regards to this scripture. He says, rather than be an obstacle that caused people to stumble, Paul chose to be a stone upon which they could step. Rather than be an obstacle that caused people to stumble, Paul chose to be a stone upon which they could step. So we live in Roland Heights, and I don't know how well any of you know Roland Heights, but in Roland Heights it's 85 or 90% Asian, right? And these people blow me away with some of the things that they do. Namely, their driving. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Why are you guys shaking your head? Come on, man. I love them and they know I love them. But when they greet each other, have you ever seen two Asians, especially the Chinese, have you ever seen them greet each other? Do they do this? Do they do this? We do this. They don't do that. They do this. Oh, you live in Monterey Park. Yeah, they do this. Why do they do this? Anybody know why they do this? Because it's symbolic. They're telling you, in this mind where I have understanding, and in your mind where you have understanding, I honor you in that I am communicating to you that you have more understanding than I do, and therefore I'm putting my head at a lower place than yours. Total humility. Total humility. That's in effect what Paul was doing. Right? Now, application. Someone might say, I don't really see this as some kind of a great sacrifice. I love Jews. I don't have a problem. I don't see why anybody would have a problem with Jewish people. I love Jews, and I do too. And Gentiles. Of all kinds of Gentiles. I'd be happy, I'd be thrilled to death to go to Africa on a missionary team, or to go to China, or to go to Mexico. I love all people. Come on, Mario, right? And I would say, okay, but I know human nature enough to know that each one of us has prejudices to overcome. We're in church, everybody's on their best behavior, but we know in our heart of hearts that we all have prejudices that we have to overcome. And let me give you a couple of examples, just in case I've lost you. I want to put you in touch with some of those things. It's very important that we get in touch with those things. I know some Christians in 12-step fellowships, I know them personally, right? Who refuse flatly, you couldn't pay them enough money to attend or identify with people in another 12-step fellowship. And if you talk to them about those people in the other 12-step fellowship, they almost talk as if though they're above them. I don't know if you've seen it. I've been around 28 years. I've seen it a lot, right? I know some Christians that come from or are maybe Southern Mexicans, if you know anything about that. And they will not fellowship with Northern Mexicans. And they've been walking with the Lord for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. They just can't let go of some things, right? In the Old South, some Christians will tell you that Sunday is the most racially divided day in America. Because black people won't set foot in a white church because of the resentment they have against white people that they will not let go of. And some white people will not set foot in a black church because of the resentment that they have against black people. I'm talking about prejudices. He said, Mario, I don't feel that way at all. I attend both fellowships. I put $2 in the basket. If you're in recovery, you know what I'm talking about, right? Well, okay. How about feuding relatives? How about Christians who have relatives that they flatly refuse to speak to because of an old resentment? Something happened somewhere along the line. We all have prejudices, and that's my point. The question is, at what point Do we humble ourselves the way Jesus did, the way Paul did, and let go of those prejudices in exchange for the hope that somebody might be saved? I could give you some examples, but I don't want to name names of people that I just did not like. They insulted me because they know what we do here. They said something behind my back. They did something. They went on Facebook and they posted a video or something that was the most insulting thing to our church and what we believe in, what we stand for. And in my heart of hearts, I said, man, I'll do my best not to hurt them, but I'll never speak to them again. I have the message that changes life. I won't give it to them. I have felt that way because I'm a human being, right? But it's very important that we let those things go. Very important. Because notice the last 3 verses of the chapter, and we're almost done here. And when we read them, you're going to realize that the day is coming when we're going to wish that we had let go of all of our prejudice and made more sacrifice to share the gospel with more people, because if not, we're going to forfeit a great reward. And you might have heard it so many times that you've just worn out the shine on this blessing. But it is immense. It is so big that words can't describe it. In fact, God, I'm going to show you in a minute, He's going to describe it to us, and chances are we're still not going to get it. But I want you to take it home and meditate on it, right? Look what He says in verse 24. Let's start there. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run? Comparing Himself to the athletes in Greece and Corinth and Athens, where I think the Olympics began. He's comparing Himself to these athletes. He says, but only one receives the prize. He says, run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now, they do it to obtain a perishable crown. The winners of the Olympics do it to obtain a wreath that goes around their heads. But it's temporal. The little leaves are all going to fall apart over time. Not so with us, right? We're doing it for an eternal crown. He says, but we Christians for an imperishable crown. A crown that's waiting for us in heaven where rust and moths can't get to it to destroy it. It's eternal, right? He says, therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. He said, thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. I love this. He says, I'm not a shadow boxer. When I was growing up as a kid, I loved boxing. And if I would have had it I don't think I had the courage, but I would have liked to have been a professional boxer. Armando Muniz is a personal friend of mine. And when I was 17, 18, I had just started using, but I went to start training at the Main Street Gym in downtown LA on Main Street. It's been a lot of years since that place has been there. But Kilroy used to be the sparring partner with Danny Red Lopez at that gym. And one day I was there, and a lot of noise, the wake, people yelling, jump, and all of a sudden, in the moment, everything went silent. And I had a trainer, and I was a great shadow boxer. You put me in the ring, man, and all of that just goes down the toilet, right? But I was shadow boxing in the mirror. And everything went quiet. Now, my trainer, he would get mad if you didn't stay focused, right? But I'm looking at the mirror. Something's going on. What's going on is Muhammad Ali just walked in. And he went in there to train and to spar. And they're like, wow, including myself. But Muhammad Ali wasn't a shadow boxer. He was the real deal. Armando Muniz was not a shadow boxer. The other guys will put you in a coma if you're not an experienced professional fighter, right? Paul says, when it comes to ministry, when it comes to a Christian experience, I don't shadow box. I'm the real deal, right? He says, but I discipline my body. I bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Heavy, heavy statement. Because first of all, Paul compares our eternal rewards and Christian experience to the temporal rewards of an Olympic athlete. Number one, right? Not to say that we compete with each other. We do. If you're competing with another Christian for ministry or whatever it is, man, you're doing it all wrong. We don't compete against each other. Really, that would be easy for some of us, right? But we don't do that. Our competition is what? It is our flesh and its resistance to sacrifice, selflessness, and our use of the gifts and talents that God gave us. Our flesh says, don't do it. Stop showing up in church. Stop studying for all those hours. Get rid of all the books, Mario. Do your thing, baby. You like boats? Go buy a boat. You love to fish on Catalina Island. You love to womanize. You love to go gambling. You love to do your thing. Life is short, man. I don't know what your flesh tells you. My flesh tells me all that kind of stuff. Do your thing, baby. Life is short. It's all about you anyway. Nobody appreciates what you do. These are the talks that my head has with me sometimes, right? So my battle, your battle, is with your flesh. Selflessness, sacrifice, using the gifts and talents that God gave you. A lot of Christians don't even know the gifts and talents that they have, let alone polish them and put them to use the way God called them to do. But it's like what Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 25. Do you remember what Jesus talked about there when he talked about gifts and talents? Anybody remember that? I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. He told a story about one guy who was given 5 talents or gifts. Okay? And that guy, he worked hard and he sacrificed and he turned 5 talents into 10. And then there was another guy that received 2 talents. He worked hard and he sacrificed and he turned the 2 talents into 4. And then there was another guy, he was given 1 talent. And this guy buries it in the ground. No work, no sacrifice, no profit. Right? And then Jesus says that at the end of the day, the master shows up to see what they've done with the talents. And the first and the second guy are told, Matthew 25, verse 23, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Right? But then the third guy was told, verse 26, you wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers. At least you could have put it in the bank to earn interest. He said, and then at my coming, I would have received back my own money with interest. Therefore, take the talent from that lazy guy and give it to the one who earned 5 more. This is what's happening with a lot of Christians who don't know their gifts and talents, and therefore they're not using them. And they're not studying with them in order to be able to produce. The master's on his way. What have you done? Right? And we're not competing with each other, and we're limited to the talents that he gave us, but use them. If you have a janitorial gift, clean the bathrooms. Whatever it is. Right? So, the third guy was fired, or Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he was disqualified. Why was he disqualified? Because he was a poser. He was a phony. He was an opposite of Paul's illustration. He didn't train. He didn't diet. Athletes are supposed to diet, right? He didn't sacrifice his prejudices. He held on to them. He didn't deny his flesh the pleasures of the world. He lived for himself and produced no eternal rewards, is what happened to the guy, right? So Pastor Chuck, he always used to say, we've got one life to live. It soon will pass, and only what we've done for Jesus Christ will last. Nothing else will matter after you leave this earth except what you did for Jesus Christ. Right? So in closing, I just want to mark our minds with some correlating scriptures. Maybe you want to write them down. Maybe you want to, I don't know, maybe you're a memorizing type of person. But they're very important. And outside of the context that we're talking about, you would sit back and ponder and say, why is God comparing me to the sun and the moon and the stars? How does a soul correlate with those kinds of things? Look what he says. First, in Proverbs 11, verse 30, it says, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise. They're thinking about the future, right? In Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, it says, those who are wise, listen, shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, like the heavens. And those who turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. Human beings, souls, after this life, they shine like the sun, the stars, and the moon. What are you talking about? Look at 1 Corinthians 15, verse 41 through 42. There is one glory. This is interesting. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. I know that. You know that. Tonight, look up, you'll see it. But what does that have to do with souls? Look what he says. For one star differs from another star in glory. Oh, wait a minute. We're on to something now. Verse 42. So also is the resurrection of the dead. What is God telling us? He's telling us something very specific, and this is what he's telling us. How much we enjoy heaven for an eternity is going to be in direct proportion to our level of sacrifice and selflessness on this earth for a moment. That's what God is saying. It is not about this life, people. It's not about this life. It's about the next one. What a sad story it would be if it was all about this life. Because you're no J. Paul Getty, and neither am I. But if we have Jesus Christ, we got it all. The Bible says he is our all in all. So, how much we enjoy heaven for eternity will be in direct proportion to our level of sacrifice and selflessness on earth for a moment. I want that to be etched into your mind, because that's going to be the fuel that is going to launch your Christian experience. And you will do it with love and joy and all the willingness you ever knew if you just love the Lord. It'll be so automatic. But don't check out. Stay focused like that athlete. They train, they work hard, they diet, they study, they get in shape, they listen to their teachers. They're up in the morning, into bed early. Good night's rest and all the rest of it. And there's a lot of things that we need to do in our Christian experience to perfect the call that God put in our life. And each one of us have a call. Each one of us. Don't doubt that. I don't know, Mario. Read your Bible before you. All right? It's true. It's true. So with that, let's go ahead and pray. And then these guys are going to close us out with a song. And you might have thought I went over my time.